evening, everyone. Um, a leading voice on the Palestinian issue, Professor Rashid Khalidi needs no introduction. He received his BA from Yale in 1970 and his DPhil from Oxford in 1974. He is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, New York. He is the editor of the Journal of Palestinian Studies and was president of the Middle East Studies Association and an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 91 until June 93. He is author of several books, including The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, Brokers of Deceit, How the US Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, 2013, Soviet Crisis, American Dominance and the World War in the Middle East, 2009, The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints, and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, Under Siege, PLO Decision-Making During the 1982 War, and he's also the co-editor of Palestine and the Gulf and the Origins of the Arab Nationalism, and the other Jerusalem, Rethinking the History of the Sacred City. He has co-edited 3 others and has published over 100 academic articles. He has written op-eds in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune and Guardian, and many other newspapers, as well as journals, and has appeared widely on TV and radio in the US and abroad. We are extremely delighted that he agreed to join us for this illuminating talk, and we look forward to engaging with him.
Thank you, Devashmita. I'll give a brief abstract of the talk, and I'll hand over the mic to Professor Khalidi. The Palestinians have spent the last century in denial of statehood, denial of history, and denial of their very existence. In this landmark history, Rashid Khalidi draws on his family's and others' experiences and archives to reclaim people's fundamental right to narrate their own history on their own terms. Beginning in the final days of the Ottoman Empire, Khalidi demonstrates how Palestinians' nascent nationalism was confronted by a project to take over their homeland, which early Zionists openly admitted was a colonial one. This was the start of a multi-stage war against the Palestinians, backed by the world powers. Khalidi interweaves the voices of journalists, poets, and resistance leaders with his own memoirs as a witness to the events, including the 19th of Beirut. His analysis of Palestinian resistance to colonization exposes the positions that secured victories, as well as the mistakes that contributed to defeats. This is the book on which today's talk is based. It's called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance 1917 to 2017. And once again, thank you very much, Professor Khalidi, for agreeing to speak with us. And I hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaka, and thank you to all of you who are in attendance. I'm struck by how widespread the interest in this book is. It has been now published in 14 different editions, 2 in India, 1 in China, 2 in China, 1 in Korea, and then several European and South American countries. And I'm touched by the fact that there is so much interest in this issue, given the amount of misinformation, given the powerful propaganda, which upholds a essentially false narrative about what is happening in Palestine and Israel. I'm going to talk about several aspects of this book. I'm going to discuss how I came to write it and how it differs from other books I've written. As was mentioned in the very kind introduction, I've written 8 different books and co-edited several others, many of which deal with the issue of Palestine. But this one is fundamentally different from them. So I'm going to talk about how I came to write it and how it differs from others. The second thing I want to do is to explain the title of the book. As mentioned, it's entitled The 100 Years War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. And I think each of the elements of that title is important in explaining why this book is fundamentally different from so much else that one might read about Palestine. And I will go into that in some depth, I hope. Finally, I'll discuss briefly the structure of the book, how I describe this 100 Years War on Palestine, and
Professor
why I
Khalidi.
describe it rather
Professor
than
Khalidi.
as a war in
Hello,
Palestine.
Professor Khalidi.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's some technical problem. Is it fine if you can leave and rejoin, because there seems to be some technical problems from our side.
So what would you like me to do?
Is it fine now? Okay, I think it's fine now.
Okay. So should I go ahead?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Would you like me to repeat any of what I've already said? Was that audible to the audience?
Just about the structure of the book.
Fine, very briefly, I'll go back over that. So what I propose to do is to talk about how I came to write the book and how it differs from others. I propose to explain the title, 100 Years War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance. And I propose to discuss the structure of the book, how I explain this war on Palestine. So let me talk briefly about how I came to write the book. For those of us living in the United States, and for people living in Europe, and for maybe others living around the world, can I ask everyone who is attending to please mute, because the interruptions are a little disturbing. So please mute your
I'll just
your phones and your computers if you're listening in. Because of this level of misinformation, because of the incorrect way in which what happens in Palestine is characterized, as a result of many, many decades of successful propaganda, I chose very, very explicitly to describe this as a war in which the Palestinians are the target. And Mir Sohel, can you please mute? Can you please mute? Thank you so much. I don't know if everybody else can hear this, but I am hearing it. So this book differs very much from other books that I've written. I wrote it in the way I did essentially because members of my family, my son in particular, who is a playwright, a friend, a cousin and close friend of mine, who has served in diplomatic and legal capacities, both said to me, all of your work thus far is essentially directed at other academics. Write something that is accessible to the ordinary reader. Write something in which you bring in your own personal experiences. And so this book is an attempt to do that, to not write to other historians, not write in terms of academics, but rather to make this book accessible, relatable, readable by ordinary citizens, by ordinary readers. And I hope I've been able to do that with this book. And I brought into it many things that as a historian, I would never have normally thought of including in anything that I write. I talk about my own personal experiences. I lived in Beirut for many years, during which the PLO was there. I was present for many phases of the war in Lebanon, the Lebanese civil war, the various interventions, and the Israeli invasion of 1982 that led to the siege of Beirut and that led to the Sabra and Shatila massacres in September of 1982. I describe my own personal experiences in these and other episodes in the book. I talk about my own family. I talk about my wife's family. I talk about other families that I've known, using memoirs, using interviews, and so forth. So the book is an attempt to tell the story from a different perspective and to tell it in a very unconventional way. I've written over 100 academic articles. I've written 8 books. I've never used the first person before, except perhaps in a preface or in acknowledgments. But the body of this book includes a great deal of material that is personal. It's rigorously documented. There are 45 pages of footnotes for those of you who are interested in reading about the history of Palestine. This would be a good place to start. And you can follow up with your readings, but at the same time, you can read it without looking at those footnotes. Okay, let me explain now the title. Why did I call this a war on Palestine? There are many false explanations of what happens in Palestine between Palestinians and Israelis. One of the most pernicious is an attempt to picture this, what is happening in Palestine, as the last phase or a recent phase of a millennial-old persecution of the Jewish people, of a thousands and thousands of years history of the trials and tribulations of Jews in Palestine. This is essentially false. This is not a millennial conflict. This is a conflict that is a direct result of modern Western imperialism, of the development of modern nationalism. It is not more than 100 or 120 years old. There was no conflict in Palestine between Muslims and Jews, between Arabs and Jews before the late 19th century. None whatsoever. No persecution, no conflict, nothing that in any way resembles what has happened since the rise of Zionism, since the rise of Palestinian and Arab nationalism, and since the eruption of European imperialism into the Middle East, specifically with the conquest of Palestine in 1917 by the British. These are the triggers for what we see today in 2023, not some millennial old Muslim Jewish hatred, not some persecution of the Jewish people in Palestine since time immemorial. These are falsehoods. There's absolutely no grounds for understanding this as a millennial conflict, as an age-old conflict. It is a brand new conflict, the direct result of European imperialism, of settler colonialism, and of the rise of nationalism among Jews and among Arabs. Before those things, i.e., before sometime in the 19th century, there was no conflict, did not exist. And this is very, very important because nationalism has a tendency to adopt and refashion history. All nationalisms do this. Indian nationalism does it. Arab nationalism does it. Zionism does it. And one of the things that has been extremely attractive is to attach a 19th and 20th century struggle to a biblical narrative in the case of Zionism. This relates in a certain understanding of events in Palestine to a biblical narrative that in fact has very little, if anything, to do with why there are people dying today in Palestine, why there's a struggle going on in Palestine. This is entirely, in other words, a result of modern phenomena: nationalism, imperialism, colonialism. The second myth that I seek to demolish with this book, and the title is an attempt to do that, is the myth that these are two peoples more or less on an equal basis, one with the state, Israel, the other with the Palestinian Authority. And that this is a war. So when Israel attacks Gaza, Israel is at war with the Palestinians. And this is somehow seen as a situation with two equal parties and a situation of balance. This is not Germany versus France. This is not two nation states at war. On the one side, you have an established nation state created in 1948, internationally recognized, a nuclear superpower regionally, a country that has bombed 8 of its neighbors, the capitals of 8 of its neighbors, a country that has one of the most fearsome militaries on earth. On the other side, you have a people that have never enjoyed self-determination, that have never been able to build modern state structures, that have been under colonial rule or Israeli occupation for the entirety of their modern existence. There's no equivalence in this. There's no balance in this. This is not Germany versus France. And it's very, very important to make this entirely clear. Any understanding of what is happening has to be based on this gross imbalance, on this absolute absence of equivalence between the two sides. A third element that I try to introduce with this book is an understanding that this is not just a struggle between Palestinians and Israelis. This never was just a struggle between the Zionist movement, the Zionist project, and between the indigenous population. There was always a third party. Zionism was not successful in the way in which it became successful until Britain occupied Palestine, until Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, until Britain took the mandate for Palestine from the League of Nations, until Britain instituted a fundamentally discriminatory regime to create a majority out of a minority and hand over the country to that minority. Until Britain did this, until the United Nations later on, until the League of Nations endorsed this, until the United Nations later on gave most of Palestine to this minority, none of the conflict, none of the struggle, none of the issues that we have witnessed could or would have taken place. None of it happened before 1917. 1917, British occupation, the Balfour Declaration, whereby Britain basically declared that there was one people in Palestine, the Jewish people. I'm going to read you the Balfour Declaration. It's one sentence. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That's the one people mentioned in the Balfour Declaration, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That would be like saying the existing non-Protestant population of France, to describe the overwhelming Catholic or atheist majority of France as the non-Protestants. And that is what Balfour did. He described Palestine as a country with one nation, one people. He described it as a country in which Britain would establish a national home for that people. And he described the 97% majority of the country as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The mandate for Palestine, which Britain wrote for itself in the League of Nations, amplified every point in the Balfour Declaration. It essentially set up a Jewish para-state, a Zionist para-state in Palestine, while denying the Palestinians any form of self-government. So whereas the Jewish community was given national institutions, an elected assembly, diplomatic representation, control over education, the ability to build up military self-defense mechanisms, which ultimately became the Israeli army, all the apparatus of a para-state or a state or an embryonic state. The Palestinians were denied all of these things by the Balfour Declaration, by the mandate for Palestine, which Britain accepted from the League of Nations. So the point I'm trying to make here is an absolute absence of equivalence, but also the big fat thumb of external actors on the scale. This wasn't just a bunch of Arabs and a bunch of Jews. It was a bunch of Arabs on the one side and the Zionist movement with the greatest imperial power in history up to that point behind them. And that imperial power, Great Britain, which ruled much of the globe, including India, including at one point all of North America, vigorously supported Zionism up to and including the point of suppressing the great Palestinian revolt of 1936-39 with over 100,000 troops killing, wounding, imprisoning, or exiling 10% of the Arab male population during that revolt. That was the British. That wasn't the Zionists. They could not have defended themselves in the face of that great revolt. They were a minority at that point. They had rudimentary means of self-defense, though the British massively reinforced the capacity, the military capacities of the Zionists during the revolt. But it was British arms, British artillery, British armor, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and divisions of troops who crushed the Palestinians and killed, wounded, maimed, imprisoned, exiled up to 16 or 17% of the adult male population. To say that this was a conflict between Arabs and Jews is to distort what was happening. It was a conflict between the British Empire and the Palestinians in support on the part of the British Empire of the Zionist project. And that was true after the British left in 1948. The United States and the Soviet Union, by voting for partition of Palestine, gave most of the country to its Jewish minority. A manifestly unjust action, which in fact violated the UN Charter, just as the Mandate for Palestine violated the Covenant of the League of Nations. I could go into how and why that was the case, but I don't think I need to do it. And I think the point to retain here is that Britain was not, as it liked to picture itself, an even-handed mediator balancing between two sets of national claims. It recognized, reinforced, and supported with bayonets and the Royal Air Force the national claims of one group at the expense of another group. I want to explain one more term. So I hope I've explained why I see this as a war on Palestine, and not just a war between the Zionist project and the indigenous Palestinian population, a war between the Jewish settlers brought to Palestine by Zionism and the indigenous population, backed by the might of the British Empire initially, after partition, backed by the might of the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the architects of the partition plan, which forced the partition plan through the UN General Assembly in November 1947, which armed Israel, which recognized Israel, which supported Israel financially and diplomatically. So we're talking about not a struggle just between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, or later on between the new Jewish state and the Arab armies that entered Palestine in May 1948, but between the Israelis and the Arabs with the support of the two great superpowers for Israel. And that form of external support has been crucial to understanding every phase of this conflict. The 1967 war was not just an Israeli-Arab war. It was a war launched with a green light from the United States. It was a war launched to establish a post-1967 reality, which the United States forced through the Security Council, UN Security Council Resolution 242. And I describe each of these phases, whether the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, or the Partition Plan of 1947, or UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967. I describe these as declarations of war on the Palestinians. In every one of these three cases, declarations of war by the great powers of the day, not by the Zionists. The Zionists are the beneficiaries of this, but it is the great powers that are, as it were, declaring war. The last aspect of the title that I want to talk about is the term settler colonialism and the term resistance. In the idyllic portrait of Israel, which one gets in at least the Western media, Israel is simply described as a miraculous result of the desire, it's described as an eternal desire of the Jewish people for statehood in their ancestral homeland. Now, Zionism has mobilized all of the tropes that I've mentioned, the biblical tropes, the idea of a refuge for persecuted Jews. And there's some truth to all of those tropes and a lot of falsehood as well. However, and this is really very, very important, at the same time that we can understand Zionism as a national project, which it certainly was, it's created a successful nation state. So every aspect of nationalism is there. So there's no possible way to deny this. We have to also understand it at the same time as a settler colonial project. It was not just a settler colonial project in the eyes of the native indigenous population. It was a settler colonial project in the eyes of early Zionists themselves. If you read Theodore Herzl's diaries, Herzl being the founder of modern political Zionism, the man who organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, the author of a book, The Jewish State, Der Judenstaat, which is, in a sense, the program for a Jewish state in Palestine. If you read the writings of some of the early Zionist leaders, men like Zev Jabotinsky, men like David Ben-Gurion, sometimes they're public writings, sometimes they're private writings, they're diaries and so forth. It's very, very clear that early Zionists saw themselves as European colonists returning, as they saw it, to their ancestral homeland, but part of a wave of European settler colonialism. One of the major organizations that was involved in taking over land for Jewish settlement was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. This is not some anti-Semitic libel against Zionism. This is what one of the main Zionist agencies called itself. They saw themselves as engaged in the colonization of Palestine. I'm going to read you a short passage from the writings of one of the more influential early leaders of the Zionist movement. At the time, the leader of a minority tendency, but the intellectual godfather, as it were, of modern, the most important trend in modern Zionism, the trend that led to the Likud party. It's produced prime ministers like Menachem Begin. It produced prime ministers like Yitzhak Shamir. It produced Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. His father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, was Jabotinsky's private secretary. It produced Ehud Olmert. It produced a whole string of Israeli prime ministers. Most Israeli prime ministers since 1977 have in fact been members of this revisionist trend that was created and led by Jabotinsky. In 1923, Jabotinsky wrote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." And there's a lot in that quote. First of all, a recognition of the Zionist movement as a colonizing project, as a settler colonial movement. Secondly, a recognition of the Palestinians as the native indigenous population of the country. And thirdly, a recognition of the fact that this was not a kumbaya coexistence project. This was a project to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country. Transform, this is his word, those are his words, transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. And I think it's very important to keep these things in mind. This was always an aggressive settler colonial project. This was never intended to produce coexistence. It was intended to produce the subjugation and to a certain degree the elimination of the indigenous population in favor of a settler minority, which would be turned into a majority, which in fact is what happened. So I think that this understanding of this project as both national and settler colonial is absolutely crucial to seeing why what we see is not coded the way it's coded in the Western media. This is resistance. It's not terrorism. Every colonial power since the beginning of time has produced resistance on the part of the indigenous population, whether this was colonialism in the form of settler colonialism, as in the case of North America or Australia or Algeria or Libya or Kenya or South Africa, or whether this was standard colonialism, as in the case of India or Egypt or many, many other countries, where the Europeans came in and ruled over a largely indigenous society. Settler colonialism is obviously different. There's a replacement of all or much of the indigenous population by a European settler population, which then dispossesses the native population, takes its land, steals its land, legalizes this under various forms, and produces, in many cases, white settler colonies. That's what Canada is. That's what the United States is. That's what Australia is. That's what New Zealand is. And that is also what Israel is. So these are the reasons for, I think, these are the reasons for my using these terms in the title. And I think it's really, really important to understand that in every case, this was understood by early Zionists as settler colonialism. They saw what they were doing. They made no bones about it. This changes during World War II when colonialism goes out of fashion, when decolonization begins. India becomes independent, Pakistan becomes independent, many other countries in the formerly colonized world become independent. And suddenly it's no longer fashionable to accept that you are supported by imperialism, that you are a settler colonial project, that you are like what is happening in other colonial countries. In addition, the Zionists came into conflict, I should say, with the British at the very end of the mandate. And so they were able to picture themselves as anti-colonial. We fought the British in the mid 1940s after having benefited for decades from British support, from British bayonets, from what Jabotinsky, to go back to his writings, called an iron wall. He wrote at one point, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. So Zionism, Zionist colonization, in his terms, could only have taken place behind this iron wall of British bayonets. And he said it even more explicitly further on in the same article in 1923. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces. This was always an aggressive project. This was always a project intended to dispossess the native population. And that is what I'm arguing in this book and with this title. Let me conclude. I think I have another 5 or 10 minutes. Let me conclude my presentation of the book by talking very briefly about the structure of the book. I've structured it along the lines of what I call 6 declarations of war on the Palestinians. Most of them declarations of war, not so much by the Zionist project or later on the State of Israel, as by great powers. I've already mentioned the Balfour Declaration and the mandate for Palestine issued by the League of Nations, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the mandate for Palestine in 1922. I describe these as declarations of war on the Palestinians. If you go through the Balfour Declaration, if you go through the terms of the mandate, these are charters for the dispossession of and replacement of an indigenous population by an entirely new polity. That's a declaration of war. The war actually was fought in the 1930s when the Palestinians finally rose up in an armed revolt and were crushed by the British. I describe the partition resolution of 1947 as another declaration of war. The great powers, at this stage, the superpowers that we know from the period of the Cold War, the United States, the Soviet Union, basically said, we are going to take this country with an Arab majority. We are not going to give it the self-determination that the United Nations Charter describes as appropriate for every country in the world, for every people. We are going to give most of it to a minority. We are going to support that minority with arms, and we are going to give less than half of it to its majority. This is fundamentally A, unjust, and B, a violation of the United Nations Charter, which one of whose core principles is self-determination. I describe this not as some kind of justice or some kind of neutral international document. I describe this as a declaration of war, rammed through the General Assembly with arm twisting, bribery, pressure by the 2 great superpowers. I describe what happened during and after the 1967 war also as a declaration of war for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the United States gave Israel a green light to launch its preemptive strike on the Arab countries in June of 1967. And secondly, because the United States drafted and had passed by the United Nations Security Council a Security Council Resolution 242 of November 1967, which essentially enshrined Israel's capability to continue to expand and to colonize. I can describe how that was the case, but I would argue these were also declarations of war. A 4th chapter describes the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the ultimate expulsion, the siege of Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacres, the expulsion of the PLO from Beirut, again, as a declaration of war. In this case, the war was waged by the Israeli army, but it was waged with American weapons and with an American green light. The defense minister, Ariel Sharon, comes to Washington a month before the war. He meets with the American Secretary of State, a man named General Alexander Haig. He obtains what Haig's assistant describes in his private notes as a green light for the invasion. Every aspect of what Israel plans to do is described in this meeting by the Israelis side, by General Sharon, to the Americans, and the Americans give a green light to this. I describe this, therefore, as a declaration of war, not just by Israel, but by the United States as well. And the United States then defends Israel in the Security Council for months and months while it wages war in Lebanon, besieges Beirut, It supplies Israel with weapons for a manifestly non-defensive purpose in violation of American law, something that it has continued to do up to the present day. Israel bombed Gaza with American weapons last night. What was defensive about that? I go through various episodes right up to the present, including conflict in Gaza. Obviously, the book was published in 2020, doesn't describe the latest atrocities in Palestine. But I think that what I talk about in the book, in terms of the United States being involved directly, is as relevant in 2023 as it was in 2020 when I published this book. The last thing I want to say, I won't go through the other chapters. I don't think that's necessary. The last thing I want to say will perhaps preempt some of the questions. And that has to do with how, given this background, does one see a solution, or might one see a solution, a resolution? Many proposals have been made. I myself was involved in the negotiations, which took place first in Madrid and then in Washington over a year and a half between 1991 and 1993. I followed, as a historian, many other attempts at a resolution of this conflict. Most of them, unfortunately, involve the very same process whereby a superpower puts its big fat thumb on the scales in favor of the dominant party, in the favor of Israel. The United States has never acted as an honest broker. The United States, in the words of one of the diplomats that I was engaged with, a man named Aaron David Miller, was operated as Israel's lawyer. And in fact, in some of the encounters that I participated in, the United States was even more extreme in some of its positions than was the Israeli delegation that we were negotiating with. So if you were to ask me, how can we arrive at a resolution of this? One of the problems is the United States. One of the problems is the overwhelming bias in favor of Israel on the part of the United States, which is to this day still the dominant superpower in the Middle East. Maybe that will change, maybe that's changing, but that is the situation as of today. Another requirement for a resolution of this struggle between these two peoples is, first of all, an acceptance that there are two peoples there, but also an acceptance of the idea that this resolution will have to be on the basis of justice and equality. One people cannot demand rights at the expense of the other people. One group cannot have access to this country, unlimited access of immigration, while another people is denied. As half of Palestinians who were expelled, or whose ancestors were expelled in 1967 or 1948, most of them, the right to return to their homeland. There's no way in which a just and lasting solution can be devised which doesn't involve that kind of measure of justice and equality for both groups. It is simply impossible to establish rights and security of one group at the expense of the rights and security of another group. That's not going to last. It can continue indefinitely, but it's not a lasting, sustainable, long-term solution. Both individual rights, property rights, civil rights, political rights, national rights have to be enjoyed on a basis of equality. There cannot be the idea that one group is supreme. We now have in the Israeli governing coalition, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, a party called the Jewish Supremacy Party. Now, I know that this is not the only country in the world in which the supremacy of one group is being advocated by a major political party. We have a major political party in the United States called the Republican Party, which some people would call a white nationalist party, or at least a party that advocates white nationalism, the supremacy of whites over non-whites in the United States. I know that in India, you all face similar problems. There are countries like Hungary, there are many other countries on the face of the earth, which have parties which actively advocate for the supremacy of one group over another group. So it's not, Israel and Palestine are not the only place where we have this problem. You can't have a lasting, equitable, and just political structure, a resolution of a country's problems with that kind of bigotry as the basis of your polity. And that is the problem in Palestine. It is not just a problem of a conflict between two national groups. It is that one national group which controls the entirety of the country and has done so since 1967, and which is colonizing bit by bit the remaining parts in the West Bank and Jerusalem that it did not control in 1967, is also committed to the absolute supremacy of the Jewish people over non-Jews in a country in which more than half of the population under Israeli control is now Arab. This will not stand. It cannot stand. It's unjust, it's inequitable, and it's unsustainable. So any solution, any resolution, any peace is going to depend on some formula which establishes justice and equity and absolutely equal rights, not only for every individual there, but for both groups, both polities, both national groups. Let me conclude with those words, and I'd be happy to take any questions any of you may have.
First of all, I think we would like to thank you for your wonderful talk. I think we can give him a round of applause for that.
Thank you.
So I think first we can take some questions from the Zoom audience, and then we can take some questions. Opposite, okay, you want, okay. So let's take questions from the live audience first, and then we can go to the Zoom audience. So is there anyone here who would like to ask Professor Khalidi questions? Yeah, Nishant.
Hello. Am I audible?
I can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Khalidi. This is I'm Nishant. I'm a professor here in at IIT Gandhinagar, and I was actually an undergraduate in University of Chicago when you were there, so we had some interaction. This is fun.
Did you ever take any of my courses?
I didn't take your courses, but I went to a few of the, student. You did lectures and everything. Yeah, a few of those before you left. Yeah, so it's very nice seeing you again, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming, joining us. So one of my question is actually, there's you talk about a war on Palestine, and you talk about it, in terms of, the great powers, especially United States and Israel. And I think that's something, I mean, in some sense, given United States record anyway, it's like we kind of, we expect that they would continue colonization. But my question is about the this post-colonial countries, Arab countries. I mean, the Palestinian cause became something of a kind of a land, like an unfinished project at the time of independence, right? For especially the post-colonial countries like India, Arab countries, they all took it up as something that was unfinished work of decolonization, right? And so as the United States and its allies managed to suppress that demand, but it was still there. And I think that's what made Palestine a global kind of issue, right? Rather than just a Middle East issue or an issue of that kind. So, but now what I see is that really all the post-colonial countries, like take India, for instance, where there was a clear, support for the Palestinian cause. And take Arab countries where they didn't allow Israelis even into their country, right? And that was a thing that in South Africa and everything worked, and it was still there in many. It's still there in many Muslim countries, but now UAE and all these places are just opening up everything. So in fact, with the collapse, the slow demise of the United States, the sort of changing of their superpower status very slowly, but it is changing. I think, would you say that there's almost like a war has been extended? Like now there's like a global war on Palestine in some sense, or something moving in that direction? I mean, countries that previously were big supporters are now, they just don't care.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think you point to something very interesting, which is that in the 60s and 70s and into the 1980s, the Palestinians succeeded in mobilizing a great deal of support in the non-aligned world, in the third world, in the decolonized world, as well as in the Arab world. And this was not just part of the wave of decolonization, though that, as you suggest, which is correct. It was also a result of active mobilization by the Palestinians themselves. They successfully made their case in many parts of the world. And I think they've failed to do so as effectively since the 1990s. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would add is that I'm not entirely sure we're in a post-colonial world. You and India may be, and there are some parts of the world that may be. I would argue much of the world, not most, but much of the world is in a neo-colonial state. Much of West Africa is not really controlled by its own peoples. The French and other powers are deeply involved there, whether it's now the Russians or the Turks. Much of the Caribbean, still in a neo-colonial state. Much of the Arab world, I would argue, is still in a neo-colonial state. We have not really transited to a post-colonial state in some parts of the world. Many we have. I would argue India, many parts of East Asia, they are in a completely post-colonial state. Korea is in a post-colonial state, controlled by Japan until 1945. It's in a post-colonial state today, as are many other parts of the world. But many other parts are not. And neo-colonialism means that people are obsessively attentive to whatever it is that Washington or the IMF want. Does Egypt have complete independence in 2023? I don't think so. Read carefully what's happening with the Egyptian economy. You're talking about a neo-colonial world. It's not exactly Lord Cromer. It's not exactly what you had in India with the viceroys and the Raj, but it's not that far off in some respects. The second point I would make about the Arab world and about Arab regimes like that of the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco or the Sudan, which have normalized relations with Israel, is the absence in all of these countries of any kind of real democracy. And the opposition in terms of the Palestine issue of the overwhelming majority of their peoples to normalization. The Arab Center in Qatar does an opinion poll that was just released for 2022. Overwhelming majorities of every country, of the population of every country that has normalized in the Arab world, oppose normalization. In every case, these are autocracies, or in the case of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, absolute monarchies with absolutely no voice of public opinion allowed, in fact, fiercely persecuted and by the regimes, such that you're not talking about the Arabs, you're talking about the plutocrats or the kleptocrats who own and run these countries for their own personal, familial, and regime's benefits. So the king of Morocco is opposed by the majority of his population in what he does in normalizing with Israel. The king of Bahrain is opposed vigorously by the majority of his population in this and many other respects. And the same is true of the president of the United Arab Emirates. The same is true as the generals in the Sudan who are fighting a democratic movement and who are happy to have support from Israel in so doing. So I think we have to understand that this is a problem of democracy in the Arab world. Now, it's true, there are many other countries like India, like Russia, like China, which in the past were supportive of the Palestinians and which now have excellent relations with Israel, which now have technological connections with Israel of enormous importance. IT connections, military connections, security connections, surveillance regimes are freely exchanged between the highly advanced military industrial establishment in Israel and between the military industrial establishments in Russia, in India, in Brazil, in China. So you're absolutely right. That is a fundamental change from the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s. And again, part of the problem is the divisions and disunity within the Palestinian national movement, the absence of a strong, unified national movement, the absence of a clear strategy on the part of the Palestinians, which you did have in the 60s and 70s. These victories that you referred to were not the result of the good-natured anti-colonial sentiments of the peoples of the third world. They had those sentiments. Those sentiments had to be mobilized by active, intelligent diplomacy and by a clear strategy wielded by a unified Palestinian national movement. They did that effectively and successfully for decades. And the failure of this bankrupt, divided gerontocracy that controls Palestinian politics today is one of the reasons for the absence of a greater degree of international support. I would say one more thing, which is that in the absence of effective leadership by the Palestinian political class, the bankrupt, self-interested Palestinian political class, you've had efforts by Palestinian civil society that have been extremely effective. The BDS movement has terrified Israel. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has mobilized the Israeli lobby in the United States in a way that it has never been mobilized to oppose BDS. They are terrified. They describe it as an existential threat. That is something done in spite of the bankrupt political leadership by Palestinian civil society, by Palestinian American, Jewish American, minority American, white American students and actors in the United States. This is an independent effort, which is facing opposition from a powerful state and all of its very influential friends in the United States. And so I hold that up as an example of what can be done. Much more, obviously, could be done.
Any other questions from our live? I think there's one question in the Zoom chat box, so I'll just request Devoshmita to read the question. Long.
I see a hand raised by Afrin and another by Nasuha.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat box. It's from Afi. Says, I just wanted to ask not about the general trajectory of the Palestinian struggle, but about the personal trajectory of Edward Said, from giving legitimacy through hard work and lobbying to PLO in US when it was considered as a terror outfit there, accompanying Arafat and co in various meetings and negotiations, to the discontents with Arafat before and after Oslo Pact, which even went on to an extent of Arafat banning Sayed's books, his personal trajectory, which also overlaps with the political trajectory of Palestine, shows us many critical diversions. That goes till his proposition of one-state solution in one of his pieces in New York Times in the late 90s. What do you think about his shift from a radical political campaigner to someone who poses an ethical question of two people in one land and of one state solution?
That's an interesting question. I actually don't think that Said changed from being a radical political campaigner. I think he always was that. I think that's an accurate way of describing him. And I think that all of the questions that he was posing, even when he was involved with the PLO, was one of the advisors to Arafat. By the way, an advisor whom Arafat paid very little attention to in some respects. In every era of his involvement with the Palestine question, from 1967 until his death in 2003, I think that Said was always a radical political campaigner and always was motivated by the ethical question of, as you put it accurately, I think, two people in one land. Now, what is my view of the one-state solution? I think too much energy has been spent on debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, one state, two states, whatever, cantons, bi-state, binational. I think we should proceed from the present. The present is a one-state reality. Israel has created a one-state reality. Israel has absorbed and is colonizing and absorbing the entirety of mandatory Palestine. How do we go forward from here? And I think that there may be multiple ways to go forward. I'm agnostic as to how we might or should go forward. I think we're likely to end up with one state. Why? Because I don't think you can undo many of the things that Israel has done. And I think that decolonizing that one state might be the way to go. However, there is another problem here, which is that both Palestinians and Israelis have powerful national sentiments. How do you encompass those in a single state? I don't know the answer to that question. There are not many countries that have successfully done that. The second issue is the state of Israel and the idea of a Jewish state, whether one likes it or doesn't like it, is internationally recognized. You would have to have international recognition of a different kind of constitutional or political or diplomatic structure if one were to talk about one state. If one were to talk about the transformation of Israel from a Jewish state to a state of its citizens, or a binational state, where the Jewish people and the Palestinians have equal rights, that might or might not be possible, but it also would contravene certain understandings which are enshrined in international law. And that means there's a lot of heavy lifting there. On the other hand, I honestly do not see how some of the things that Israel has done can be undone. It has systematically worked to make a two-state solution impossible since Jabotinsky, since Herzl. The idea was always a Jewish state in all of Palestine, and that's what has been achieved. There is not a Palestinian state. There is not the infrastructure or the embryonic basis for a Palestinian state. There is a subordinate, completely Israeli-controlled structure which operates as a subcontractor for occupation and colonization. That's the Palestinian Authority. That is not an independent basis for it. That is not the basis for an independent state. So how you go from this structure, this unequal, discriminatory, racist structure, to a decolonized future is, I think, the question. And I think Edward, in that op-ed that's mentioned in the question, spoke to that.
I think Afreen and Nasua have questions. Afreen, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Ashish, for organizing this wonderful talk, and Professor Rashid. Very interesting points. However, I think the question that I come from, you might have alluded a bit to it. You had mentioned the links of the settler state with neo-colonies and post-colonies like India and China in exchanges of technologies. But I think also what is pertinent is the exchange of values like ethno-nationalism, especially with India. And to that effect, the question comes, like most of the exchanges and debates on the issue is relegated to a Muslim Palestinian versus a Jewish Israeli, right? That is what is pictured. However, where do the other native communities factor in this debate? Why are they relegated on to the periphery in the discourse? We do have indigenous Christians and other tribal groups in the region. And so much so, is this because, are we reducing this whole issue more to an ethno-nationalist consideration? And is that affecting a solution down the line? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. I understand the implications of your question for India. Let me respond to them. Let me respond to it, however, in terms of Palestine. In terms of Palestine, an ethno-nationalist project, which was always originally, at least the Palestinian project, was modified significantly with the idea of a secular democratic state, which was the original approach taken by the PLO soon after its foundation in the 1960s. And that continued to be the approach of the PLO, an argument that Muslims, Christians, Jews should all be citizens of a secular democratic state of Palestine. That objective was abandoned under intense international pressure, let it be understood, and Arab pressure, in favor of what you correctly describe as an ethno-nationalist solution, which is to say a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. The PLO accepted that starting in the late 1980s, and it's enshrined in the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. It never came about because Israel never intended there to be a Palestinian state, but that at least was the Palestinian aspiration. Now, it does not have the religious connotation, at least for most or many Palestinians, that ethno-nationalism may have in other contexts. In the Palestinian case, Palestinian leadership, Palestinian elites, Palestinian civil society have always included Christians and Muslims. From the beginning of the Palestinian national movement, immediately after the Balfour Declaration, without exception, up to the present. It's true that with groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, you have a religious cast to Palestinian nationalism. But there are countervailing secular interfaith trends, which in fact have dominated Palestinian politics from the very beginning and up until this point. people who vote for Hamas are not necessarily Muslim nationalists or ethno-nationalists who see Palestine as essentially a Muslim cause. There are people in Christian communities who voted for Hamas in the elections of 2006, I think it was. I would argue that ethno-nationalism is a problem in both cases. And in the case of Israel, it's the extreme nature of it. It should be very alarming to people. People who are white supremacists in the United States, in most cases, are ashamed to admit it. So those Republicans who are white supremacists say we're Republicans. That is to say we're against critical race theory. We're against the teaching of Black history in Florida. They don't say overtly, we are white supremacists. In the case of Israel, you have a Jewish supremacy party, which is one of the dominant forces in the governing coalition. You have even more extreme cases of this elsewhere, India, Hungary, and other places. And I agree, it is a serious, serious problem.
Thank you.
A question.
I see Nasuha.
Ask my question now.
Please go ahead.
Sir, I am a researcher at Kannur University, and my research is on Palestinian memory. So I was wondering, because the title of this talk also had the term memory in it, land, space, and memory. So as a historian, what do you think about the importance of memory in the Palestinian context, given the rampant misinformation that can be found in history and the decades of propaganda that needs to be undone, but it seems to be a momentous task. So what do you think about the importance of memory versus history?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I think that if one examines Palestinian society since the Nakba, since the catastrophe of 1948, it's very, very clear that memory has played an enormous part in sustaining Palestinian identity. I actually have a book entitled Palestinian Identity, which talks about consciousness, Palestinian national consciousness. One of my earlier books. It was published in the 1990s. It was republished in the United States, 2000 something, 10, 8. And so I think memory is extremely important. But I would add something else, which is that you are right, and I mentioned myself, the extraordinary amount of disinformation, particularly in US and European politics. I mean, essentially American policy is based on a whole series of lies and falsehoods. So is the policy of many European countries. The media, the mainstream corporate media in the United States and much of Europe repeats these lies. But there are areas where there has been significant change. One area is in scholarship. Most of the absolutely false myths that were peddled by reputable scholars for generations have now been completely debunked by scholarship in history and sociology and many other fields. It's very hard to find some of the absolute nonsense that passed for fact in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in books being published in the 21st century. Academia has changed. Academia has moved. Israeli academics, European academics, American academics, international academics have fundamentally recast our understanding. Now, that has not yet influenced much of the mainstream corporate media. It certainly hasn't influenced our politicians. They still live in la-la land as far as this issue is concerned, at least in the United States. But it has fundamentally changed academia and scholarship, fundamentally. So much of the tripe, of the garbage, of the complete falsehood that passed for discourse on Palestine has been completely discredited in academia. Their leaders did not tell them to leave. They were driven out by a systematic campaign. Palestinian refugees are the creation of Israel's ethnic cleansing. Those are accepted facts today, at least by academics. It's hard to get those facts into the New York Times or on American television, but certainly into American political discourse. But they are accepted facts in academia. And the second area where there's been changes among young people in the United States and Europe are much less inclined to believe the absolute nonsense that their elders believe about Palestine. A fundamental change has taken place. So, and I think memory has played, at least as far as the Palestinians are concerned, an enormously important role.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. I think we have just time for one last question. I had just one observation to make from my side. You did talk about the role of the bankrupt Palestinian political class. So I was just wondering that what would be your take? What is your analysis of on the role of the PLO, especially Yasser Arafat, and what was the trajectory that he wanted to sort of go ahead with? What was the crisis, and what do you think are the possible prospects of an autonomous state?
Well, those are three big questions, Ashish. I have a mixed assessment of Arafat and that generation of Palestinian leadership. I've written about this actually more in another book entitled The Iron Cage. I think that they had some significant achievements. They reunified Palestinian national identity. They rebuilt the Palestinian national movement. They achieved great diplomatic successes, but I think that they were strategic failures in important respects, in terms of internal democracy and in terms of understanding the danger and failing to understand the danger of accepting certain concessions that they made in the 80s and the 1990s. I could go into that more, but I don't know if we have time. What do I think of the prospects of an independent Palestinian state in the immediate future? Nil. Important work has to be done among Palestinians. Important work has to then be done by a reunified Palestinian national movement to mobilize the majorities in the Arab world that support the Palestinians. Hopefully in the context of a democratization of the Arab world. The lack of democracy in the Arab world is one of Israel's greatest assets. Israel feasts on undemocratic, illegitimate, weak regimes like the Egyptian regime, like many of the Gulf regimes. It needs those kinds of governments to sustain its hegemony in the Middle East. Democratization would change all of that. The countries where public opinion is able to express itself, like Lebanon and Tunisia, are countries which could not possibly normalize with Israel, because however corrupt the politicians might be, however eager they might be to have American and Israeli support, they're terrified of their own peoples, of the newspapers that would attack them, of the political parties that would criticize them, of the majorities that wouldn't sustain such a policy. Why does Jordan have a peace treaty with Israel? Because they have a gerrymandered assembly that doesn't represent the Jordanian people, and because it has intelligence services and a military and a monarchy, which basically run the country completely ignoring the views of the people. That's the case in Egypt. Egypt's population is overwhelmingly opposed to normalization. No Egyptians go to Israel. And that's not because the Egyptian government hasn't made it. Egypt was the first country to make peace with Israel. It's because public opinion rejects normalization until and unless Israel treats the Palestinians justly. So that's a second change that has to. Finally, the work that is ongoing in Europe and other countries has to be amplified to change public opinion. It is beginning in the United States. I mean, when I grew up in this country, I was born here. I was born, in fact, in this city, in New York. I've lived in the Arab world much of my life. I'm Palestinian American, but I'm an American. I was born here. Since I was born in 1948, there never was any political support in the US Congress for Palestinian rights. That has changed. It's still a minority, but you have literally dozens of members of Congress and senators who are willing to attach their names to bills in support of Palestinian human rights. That's completely new. That's a function of a change at the grassroots, in particular in the Democratic Party. It's a function of intersectionality, Native Americans, African Americans, other minorities, ordinary young people in the Jewish community and elsewhere have changed fundamentally in their understanding. Israel is not David. Israel is Goliath in the understanding of most young people today. And that has affected the Democratic Party. And that's why you have literally dozens of members of Congress willing to stick their necks out in an environment that remains fundamentally hostile, I have to say. That's new. We never had anything like that. Now, I'm not saying that trend will necessarily continue. The trend could be reversed. There's tons of money and huge political capital behind destroying that progress. Many members of Congress who supported Palestinian rights were primaried, i.e., enormous amounts of money were put into opponents who beat them in Democratic Party primaries in their districts. Some of them in the New York area, one in the Chicago area. On the other hand, most of the others won their primaries. Even the money poured into this by pro-Israel lobbies failed to unseat Alexandria Cortez and so many others. AOC, Pramila Jayapal. There's a whole range of members of Congress who have managed to resist this wave of money and lobbying. I think that those changes have to continue. And when and if they do, I think you then might have some hope for Palestinian national rights and for Palestinian human rights.
Hello. Yeah. So
Now I hear you.
yeah. So on that hopeful note, we would like to draw this wonderful lecture to an end. And once again, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to you for delivering this lecture to us. I know it's early in New York, but I'm once again grateful to you for joining us and for giving this talk. And I hope to meet you in person soon and get your autograph on.
I'd be happy to do it. And thank you so much for having me. And
Thank you.
Thanks for your patience, all of you.
And we hope to meet soon in some other.
Inshallah, I hope so.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Goodbye.